I'm Park Howell, and welcome to the Business of Story.
I thought it was just a stupid picture of a pig in the ocean. But after hearing that story, I had to have it. Now I wasn't just buying a picture. I was buying a story. Story literally made the picture worth more money to me.
That's what businesses are about. People buy brands. People buy stories much more than anything else.
I work with a lot of big enterprise companies, but let's just say I always tell folks, drop the PowerPoint, close your laptops, start with your story.
If you want people to get engaged and you want people to act, you have to tell them an emotionally powerful story. That's with great characters, it's with uncertain outcomes, and it's with high stakes and drama.
All business strategy is a story.
Have you ever had that frightening feeling of being totally lost? Well, when I was about 12, my dad took me on my very first, and only, I might add, deer hunt. That's right, deer hunting in the Pacific Northwest. He and I grabbed our gear and jumped in the Chrysler Town and Country brown wood-paneled station wagon and headed into the foothills around Mount Rainier. It was just a day trip for a little father and son bonding, which at the time was pretty special for me because, you see, I'm one of 7 Howell kids. And to have my dad all to myself for this little excursion was pretty special. So anyways, we get out there, we parked on this logging road, walked through this dense evergreen forest with the cedars and the Douglas firs still sprinkling water on us left on their branches from an early morning rain. So we made our way through the forest and we found this clearing, this beautiful river. The light mist was coming up off the water. The sun was just coming out. I mean, it was like an idyllic day. So my dad said, "Park, you go ahead and take the lead." He handed me his rifle and off we went. Well, we walked up and down the riverbank, crossed it a few times, circled back or so I thought, and we're just having a wonderful time. We're probably out there for about an hour, hour and a half maybe. And then my dad says, "Well, why don't we go back to the car and grab a sandwich, take a load off, and then we'll head back out in a little while." I said, "All right." He goes, "Okay, which way do we go, Park?" Well, I confidently pointed this way, and I waved my hand. I said, "Let's go." And off we walked. And we probably walked for, 15, 20 minutes. And where I thought the car would be, there was no car. He knew I was lost, so he just sat there and he said, "Well, all right, now which way do you think we should go?" And I, of course, confidently said, "We should go this way." He said, "All right, you lead," and off we went. And I was cruising around and realizing the more I walked, the more lost I got. In essence, my pride was becoming my compass, and there was no way I could tell him that we were lost. So we stopped. He goes, "All right, well," for the third time, he looks at me and he says, "Which way do you think we should go now?" And I pointed. He said, "Nope." Then I pointed in another direction. He said, "Nope." And then he asked, "You have absolutely no idea where you are right now, do you?" I said, "Nope." Well, I had to admit that even though I was certain as to where we were supposed to go, I now realized I was thoroughly lost. And it shook me to my core. Good thing he was there because, he knew exactly where we were and guided us back to the car. And what was most frightening to me of all was the path we took was the least familiar to me. How could have I gotten us so lost? Or at least me. He asked, "Park, what would have you done if I wasn't here? If you were alone, you would be totally lost right now." And I said, "Yeah, I get it." He said, "You'd get awfully hungry, cold, even die, or worse," he said. Or worse? What's worse than death? I didn't even ask. I figured he was just being a dad trying to make his point. Well, look, I'm lucky he was there that day, and he taught me an unforgettable lesson about wayfaring. I still think of that pit in my stomach literally every time I enter the wilderness, and I pay close attention to where I've been, where I'm going, and how to get back again. In fact, I'm pretty killer in the Disneyland parking lot. I can always find our car. In short, it's an important lesson of survival that I'll never forget. So on today's show, we have a guest who focuses on survival psychology to help brands thrive. He helps brands that are stalled, stuck, or stale find themselves and their true calling in life. Jonathan David Lewis is partner and strategy director in McKee, Wallwork and Company in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And he is the author of the new book, Brand versus Wild, Building Resilient Brands for Harsh Business Environments. On today's episode, you will learn the 7 factors that impact the survival of your business, what to do, essentially how not to panic when you find your brand is lost, and 3 things to do to ensure your survival. And then plus maybe my favorite tip is how pride kills in the wild. Boy, do I know that feeling. So strap in, take out your story map, find your purpose compass, and let's start exploring your brand in the wild with Jonathan David Lewis. Hey, Jonathan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. And it's interesting because I think we're kind of kindred spirits. We both operate or have operated agencies in smallish markets, me being in Phoenix, Arizona, and you doing some really great work out in Albuquerque through McKee, Wallwork and Company. Tell me about your market out there. What's it like working in Albuquerque?
It's definitely, in terms of advertising, presents its challenges. We don't bump into our clients at the local deli, and we don't see our prospects on the subway. So there's certainly an aspect of travel, of having to, as we put it, be a lighthouse brand and really have to stand tall and shine brightly in order to get our name out there and attract both the talent that we need to stay at the level we operate, as well as attract the type of clients that we want to service. So it's not easy, but in other ways, I would say it forces us to be better. There's certainly a complacency that can set in if you're in a bigger market like Los Angeles or Chicago or Miami, where perhaps you don't have to be as good and get by. Where, gosh, if you want to do more than survive, if you want to thrive, and you really want to get your name at a national level, you have to think differently. You have to work harder. You have to hustle. And you can't just be good enough. And you can't just be really, really good either. You have to have a niche. You have to have something that makes you different. So it's definitely presented a challenge and an opportunity for us.
Well, and Hollywood's been showing up pretty regularly out to shoot shows like Breaking Bad in and around Albuquerque. Has that helped? Has that given you any sort of boost in business, shot in the arm?
It's definitely brought some talent to the market that helps on the production side as we're looking for some production partners. So that helps. Certainly not having to go to Austin or somewhere is really important to us as we want to support our local community. Beyond that, I don't think we've seen any marked difference in the advertising industry as affected by Hollywood, but it's fun to see, it's fun to see a star at the local hotel or at a restaurant every now and then.
Yeah. Bob Odenkirk, we're good friends with his older brother who actually works in the banking real estate industry down in Tucson. So we get to follow Bob, first on Breaking Bad and now Better Call Saul, which I believe they're shooting out in Albuquerque as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's fun seeing that. And the crazy thing here in Arizona, which we have some of the most beautiful, picturesque places to shoot, Arizona, the state, and all of its wisdom has pretty much reduced all of their tax breaks to nil. So we get very little production through this town, and that's dating back, I think, to the early 1990s. And so it's ironic that this great talent and production capabilities are either driving through or flying over top of Arizona to go to New Mexico and shoot. But I think that's sort of what happens in some of these markets, that we're working in. That you're not the top tier market, so you're dealing with folks and businesses that don't always have that big vision or the guts to do big time work. And yet, after looking at your guys' portfolio, it looks like you guys are doing some really nice work out there.
Yeah, I've got to say, credit to some of our local clients who have followed us on this journey and have represented their own courage in really shaking up their own industries and pursuing messaging that is just completely out of the box. And so, we have clients in death care, which is a very conservative industry. And we have a client who just has really trailblazed their own industry and allowed us to serve them in that. And that's local. And then when you break out of that and you look at some of our national clients, certainly they have their own perspective and have allowed us to do some great work. But it's kind of tough. You think about, these different states giving tax incentives to bring Hollywood execs out here and other things. And it's always, there's a lot of controversy around it. It's always a little temporary. It works for a little while until every other state starts doing it as well. So some of the immediate impact we received a few years ago has dampened as other states have followed suit, including Canada has also pursued a lot of incentives to bring production up there.
Absolutely. So, Jonathan, you've got a new book out, Brand versus Wild, Building Resilient Brands for Harsh Business Environments. And what has piqued my interest about your book is, in essence, you're living it as a brand in Albuquerque, in the wilds of New Mexico, off the beaten path of LA, Chicago, Dallas, New York. And you guys had some real tremendous growth, and then kind of saw it all sort of shrivel up or get really flat, which had, you all scrambling to do some new things that you learned about, I imagine, that are in your book. So tell us a little bit about how did this book come about from your own experiences, and let's go from there.
In terms of our own growth and success, it's really interwoven with our niche and how that niche made this all possible. And you mentioned that, a number of years ago, a little over 10 years ago, we made the Inc. 500 fastest growing companies list. And we thought we made it. We thought, okay, finally we're there. We've achieved this great success. And shortly after we received this prize, our growth stalled itself. And then we experienced about 2 to 3 years of near 100% turnover, which is just killer in a professional services firm.
And what caused the turnover? Lack of business, or just looking for other opportunities?
It's one of these things, and it's a theme that's really explored in the book. It's once there's a malaise, once people feel like you're lost and like you are wandering and you're drifting, there's a real emotional response from a staff. And people, whether you're articulating it or you're running away from it or not, people know. The people that work for you know. They feel it. And, somebody left, and then another person left, and people could tell. And it kind of snowballed after a while. And during this time, leadership, while, with the best intentions and with, certainly skill, tried to do their best, but still we didn't know what to do. And this was really the catalyst for what became our niche and what really has allowed us to grow both inside and outside of our state and thrive, even though we are in the wilderness known as New Mexico, and especially wilderness when you consider advertising. We're not a market you would normally think of.
So you guys found yourself in this wilderness, and you said it was about 10 years ago? So you were... Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Little over 10 years ago. And so we found ourselves in this wilderness ourselves. We didn't know what else to do, but we had access to the last 20 years of Inc. 500 winners. So we did the only thing we could think of, which was research. And we decided to actually contact these previous winners and try to understand why are some of these highly successful companies who faced adversity, why do they face it and then get past it and grow and thrive? And why do others who have had success face adversity and can't quite get past it? They stall, they go backwards. And from that initial research, we discovered there's actually 7 factors that affect growth in business. Then over the course of this last 10 years, we conducted another national study, reconfirmed our research that led to a couple of books, our niche, which is really working with brands that are stalled, stuck, or stale, and ultimately led to my book, which just came out a few weeks ago, Brand versus Wild, which is really a culmination of all of our learnings of how organizations who find themselves disrupted or facing some particular challenge that is causing their growth to stall, how are they very predictable in their response to that challenge? How do they decline very predictably? And then how do you stop the bleeding and actually get healthy again?
So your agency, again, McKee, Wallwork and Company, your brand differentiator or your story to say per se is brands that are stalled, stuck, or stale, which I love, by the way, because it really gives you a focus to your overall mission. How do you get a brand to self-assess themselves to say, you're right. We are stalled, stuck, or stale, because that takes a lot of courage for a leader within a brand to step up and actually own that to the point that they would hire you to come in and fix it.
That's a really good point, because one of the issues we face, that we all face, is denial, especially when we're lost. And, we faced it as we drifted ourselves 10 years ago. And most of our clients or prospects face it at some level. And it's only when you're able to get to the point where you first admit that you're lost, and then you submit to your own circumstances, that there are things outside of your control. Only at that point can you come to the place where you're willing to ask yourself some hard questions, and then perhaps look to others to help guide you out of this wilderness.
So you're literally talking about the 5 stages of death: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. I suppose a brand goes through that in their own way, and somewhere within those states, maybe they're accepting that they are in decline, and it's at that point that they step up and invest in your services to help them pull out of their death spiral, if you will.
Yeah, that's right. And it'd be kind of an interesting study to look at the 5 stages of grief and kind of overlay it with what we've discovered. But what we found was there, in the 7 factors that affect growth, 3 of them are external, and they're what we call the wild. So they're the economy, the aggressive competition, perhaps disruption in your industry. What got us excited and what we really found has helped our clients and actually helped us help them is that 4 of the statistically significant factors that affect growth are internal. They're within our control. They're things that often we overlook or misunderstand. And, they start with something around fear. There's a real loss of nerve whenever we're facing with disruption. But that quickly turns to a loss of focus. And that's where your brand starts to drift and you don't know what else to do. So you're trying things, which quickly turns into inconsistency. And this is where we say the wild actually turns brands wild. And then finally, we find that companies can turn savage. And this is a lack of alignment internally. And we see it in both in our brands, but also in actual survival stories and in the latest survival psychology. That I think one of the most poignant stories that I've read recently in the research was, I think everybody's probably a little familiar with Into Thin Air, but there's this famous story where these very high level climbers are trying to get to the top of Everest, and they get to a certain point and they're in trouble, and without aid from another team, they're unable to proceed and were in fact facing death. But this other team comes along, finds them, and helps them. Well, later in their climb, they come across another team that needed help. And they decided to proceed and not help them, even though they had been given that same help. And when the leader of this team of climbers, came back down the mountain, they were confronted by some reporters, and essentially they were asked, how could you justify this, pretty immoral decision? And the response was, there is no morality above 18,000 feet. And that is where a lot of our prospects, a lot of really the businesses in the world around us find themselves as the pressure is on. A lot of what we normally would think is immoral or unethical goes out the window because we're just trying to survive. And that's where what we call companies turn savage.
Yeah. And Into Thin Air, by the way, for those that you don't know of it, is John Krakauer's book about the devastation that happened on Mount Everest back in October of 1999 when several people were lost on the mountain and some really top hiking guides. And John Krakauer is a writer out of Seattle that was actually on the trip and witnessed all of this stuff and wrote his account about it. It is an absolute page turner. I think I read that book in like 2 days, and then I read everything I could get my hands on about that whole expedition and how it went south. And you're so right, Jonathan, that it is, you see leadership, you see animal instincts come out. You see pure survival instincts that reveal us of what we really are. And we are, animals in a lot of respects of just trying to survive. And it's the stories that we tell ourselves and live into that get us through our toughest environment. So let's take it from the top. Let's go through the 7 steps that you found. And is it kind of like those 5 stages of grief? Is it the 7 steps in order? You see this the way it goes down?
Yeah, well, once the wild strikes, once one of those 3 external factors hits, so the
okay,
economy,
so let's do that again. So we've got the 7 factors. You've got the 3 external factors, which are
an economic recession or the economy fluctuating in some way, an aggressive competitor, coming in and shaking up the industry, or discounting, doing something you're not expecting, or industry disruption itself, which would, the most common example today might be Uber or somebody who comes in and just does something completely disruptive to what many think is a static, safe industry. So that's the... Go ahead.
I was just going to say, once we think we're static and safe is when we're in our most peril, because it is disruption that we always have to live into. It's within disruption, depending on our response to it, which makes us a relevant and unique and urgent brand in the hearts and minds of our customers. But if we're not paying attention to that disruption, then like you say, we find ourselves at the end of our rope hanging off a cliff and now what?
And it's actually success that can be one of our biggest vulnerabilities. If you have found success in whatever regard, that is where you're at the most vulnerable, because you can become arrogant, which is the first step to being lost. But second, you can begin to believe that whatever made you successful will continue to make you successful. And that is a myth. That is just completely false in today's modern economy.
Wow, that's great. So keep going. Take us through the next factors. This is really fascinating.
So the wild is what causes us to feel disoriented. Mm-hmm. And this is what really is the catalyst for what is a very predictable response to disruption, which is those 4 internal factors. So once you feel lost, that's when fear strikes. That's when a very physiological response begins in your body, and your rational brain kind of moves to your irrational brain, and adrenaline strikes and flows through your body, and you start making pretty bad decisions, and you get tunnel vision. And there's a really famous survival theory out there by Dr. John Leach, who's conducted studies on survival situations for years and years. And he says that in any survival situation, there's 3 types of responses. He calls it the 10-80-10 theory. If you're facing a challenge, 10% of us will respond rationally, logically. And in fact, not only can we get through it, but often we'll lead others through it. 80% of us are paralyzed. We react with fear, and we don't know what to do, so we don't do anything. And then another 10% of us actually panic. We make things worse for ourselves and can actually make them worse for others. Now, the thing is, if you are in a situation, or you should expect to be disrupted at some point, you need to understand, where do you fall in that 10-80-10 theory? And unfortunately, it's likely you're in that 90% that are going to react poorly. And understanding yourself in that, and how you react, and how many companies tend to react, there's a very, very automatic response in many ways. So a recession strikes, many companies might pursue lines of business they shouldn't, or they start discounting, or all of these other strategies that tend to degrade a brand. There's a pretty automatic response, and if you know that about yourself, you can prepare, you can be ready. Once you're afraid, that's when you get tunnel vision and you start to drift as a brand. And you've heard, be all things, all people. That's where this begins to happen, and you're panicking. So you're pursuing business you shouldn't pursue. You're pursuing targets that maybe in the short term you think might bring in some business, but long term they're just completely degrading you as a company.
I suppose it's that hunter-gatherer instinct kicks in. It's like, oh my God, I got to hunt down and gather any kind of revenue I possibly can just to get through this tough time.
That's absolutely right. And you see this in many great examples through the years. So many people don't know that Marvel and Lego were both near bankruptcy near the turn of the century in the early 2000s. And if you look at somebody like Lego, they not only were afraid when they conducted this research and discovered that millennials, according to the research, were very different and not interested in working with their hands and were digital minded. They began to lose their focus by completely changing their product. They made their Lego sets easier. They made their Lego blocks bigger. They complexified, which in many ways, which they thought was making things easier. They even went as far as they were investing in amusement parks. They even built a toy that was much more like a G.I. Joe than an actual Lego block. They had completely lost themselves. And because of that loss of focus, they were near bankruptcy. And it was, it took several years and some intense focus to get them back to where they are today is actually the largest toy maker in the world. It didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't easy. And so I think that's a really good lesson in focus, that it's easy to lose and it's really hard to get.
And I would imagine. Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to say, and I would imagine coming out of the recession too, so many brands had lost their focus because they were so incredibly disrupted that they're like, oh my God, we just got to bring in as much business as we can. So they started flailing around like a poor swimmer caught up in a river, and just reaching and grabbing at any sort of potential billable account, the incorrect client, whoever that might be, just to get them through. When actuality, I guess, is they got to take a deep breath, find a stroke that works best for them, and use that stroke to get back to solid land and solid footing.
And it's a good point because, especially in professional services, and if you're in a medium-sized market like we are, man, it is so tempting to take any business that comes across your desk. But it's the no. It's the power of no. And if you don't say no, and if you don't have a criteria for saying no, then you already have lost your focus. You already are hamstringing yourself. You won't get to where you want to get because you don't even have focus in the first place. And it's impossible to become, that lighthouse brand, to become that national agency or PR firm or whatever you are, unless you have a differentiator. And that requires focus.
And do you have a criteria that people should follow in saying no? Do you have like a little checklist? Do they do this, 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 this? What helps people say that?
I think it begins with 3 simple questions. And this is to find both your focus and your differentiator. And the first question is, what am I really, really, really good at doing? And it helps if nobody else is good at doing that. So if you're saying something generic, that's not good enough. You need to get narrow here. So for us, it would be, we are the world's leading experts in turning around stalled, stuck, and stale brands. Now, no one else can say that. Nobody else has the decade of research. Nobody has the 3 books that we have. And that's taken a lot of work. But that is our thing. What is your thing? So what am I really, really, really good at doing? But then the next question is key. What does my customer absolutely need? Because where those 2 things intersect, that's the third question. Where do those 2 things intersect? That is where you find relevancy in today's quickly shifting, quickly changing marketplace. Now, this applies to any business. It especially applies to those of us, like you and I and many of these listeners, who are giving advice to businesses around the country. If we don't take our own medicine, if we don't have a focus, if we'll take anything that comes along, then we'll never get to that next level. We'll never achieve whatever that goal is because we don't even have the courage or the focus to say no for ourselves. So true, Jonathan. We had a good friend of mine, Greg Head, who's the former head of marketing for Infusionsoft, and he's been in the tech world for 30 years. And he has a great line. He says, the universe actually rewards no. So the more, to your point, the more you say no, 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 and to find that right client, the universe has a way of sending you then the clients that fit that criteria you're talking about. And the second point I want to make on that is I think you're so dead on. What am I really, really good at in this land, in this world of abundance? Meaning you are one of a gabillion different ad agencies people could choose from. But you all have had the courage to say, we are really good at turning around these stuck and stale brands. That's what our focus is. So with that in mind, if you get a big, robust brand show up that are just, really doing great, and they're asking you, can you help us, continue doing what we're doing and maybe amplify that success, do you tell them no? Well, if we're not right, certainly. But usually in that scenario, it's about avoiding the predictable responses to disruption. So if you want to bolster yourself, if you want to protect yourself from the fear and inconsistency and lack of focus, and et cetera, then you're almost putting on the armor, preparing for battle in that case. Where we're not very helpful is, in certain scenarios where perhaps, it's a small entrepreneurial company who is disrupting. Now we can brand you, we can give you a great story, but perhaps we're too expensive in that scenario, and you'd be better served by somebody else, or perhaps you're near death. You've already made these decisions. If you're at that point, it's you're not going to get the approval from the board to spend the money on what we're going to provide, and also depending on the side of company you are, you need to have some limits on the size of client that you'll take. If it's too small, maybe it's too big if you can't service them. And that's something we've had to say no to, or really define how we would be of value. We're not able to do all this stuff for you, but here, and here, we can provide some real help. So there's other ways to define your focus as well, where you'll never be able to give the time and effort to those clients that you serve best if you're spending those long nights servicing maybe clients that are just too small.
Yeah, really good point. So how did you guys pull out of that death spiral? So you stalled, you lost a lot of business, you had 100% or near 100% turnover. I would imagine you guys were sort of floundering, trying to figure out how to fix it. You did the research, but I'm sure you had to take some immediate steps. So what did you guys do to start righting the ship?
So the first thing we did is find ourselves, and that came through the research. When we discovered there was a real story here to tell, that there are things within all of our control that can help with growth, and they're inside your company, that's when we knew, okay, there's something here. Let's build our brand and our niche around that. And that is what led to our first book, When Growth Stalls. Once we had that, even before we wrote the book, that became our sermon, and we preached it everywhere we went, and we would show the research, and we would explain how this can help you as a brand.
And how long did that take you, though? Because you had to do the research and then write the book. So this doesn't just happen overnight. How did you keep the company glued together while you were arriving at these aha moments?
So it really comes down to this, and this is actually bolstered in survival psychology. The first thing you need to do if you're lost is stop. And what's so hard about this is your adrenaline's pumping. You might be panicking and frozen, but you don't want to stop and think. You want to sit there and turn off your brain, or you panic and you just want to do something for doing its sake. So the first thing you have to do is stop, and that's what we did through our research. We stopped and said, "What is going on here?" The next thing you need to do is orient yourself to the marketplace, or in a survival scenario, what are my surroundings? Do I need to build shelter? Did I bring enough food? Did I tell anybody I was hiking? Those sort of things. As you're orienting yourself, that's where we had to decide, okay, who is going to be the future of this company? We had to make some leadership shakeups. How are we going to grow? We had to shrink at that point to then build ourselves up to where we have built today. So we had to make some hard decisions in that regard. Then once you've oriented yourself to the marketplace, that gives you the answer to the question, what does your customer care about? What do they need? Then we started to work on our focus. And this is where we decided we're going all in on this research. We now understand how stalled, stuck, and stale brands feel and think and how to turn them around. So we built our own story at that point. Then after you have your focus, that's when you have to adapt to today's marketplace. And excuse me. And that has been so important. As a marketing professional services firm, you know this just as well as anybody. Things have changed so much. I mean, I remember when web banners were a big deal. I mean, 10 years ago, everybody thought that was pretty cool. And now they're feeling quite passé. Things have changed so much. We had to be willing to change alongside it. And we had to be willing to fail. And so we would try, we brought in, if there was something we weren't sure how to do, or if there's some new function or new expertise that we needed, we tried a variety of things. We tried to partner with people. We tried to hire it in-house. And we failed in several regards, and we succeeded in others. But we were willing to invest in order to fail. And all of those learnings over time have built us up to where we are today, where we weren't paralyzed by the pretty significant challenges we faced. We didn't just hunker down. We didn't stop investing in ourselves, in our marketing, and we had to spend some serious money to not only conduct the research, but to continue our new business efforts. And that's another one of those pitfalls. If you're having a hard time and you're not investing in your own marketing, you're making the problem worse. And all the research tells you, especially if there's a recession happening, or if you're having a hard time, if you're not investing, you're probably just kind of giving up.
Yeah. I mean, you've got to invest in the granola, the trail map, the compass. You've got to take the time to get yourself out of that tight spot that you're in. And I think you're so right. You've just got to focus your mission. And you were going through this, if my math serves me right as we were leading into the recession, because you said it was your company's about 20 years old. About 10 years ago is when you had this big crash. So it was even a little bit right before the recession, and then you guys had to muddle your way through that to get to where you are today. But it sounds like you've come out stronger, and you've got now these 3 books under your belt to help other people get through it as well.
Our first book came out right as the recession hit, and so in some ways, having our own struggle a couple of years before the recession was preparing us, and I think really was the reason. You saw it. You were there. You saw how many agencies went out of business and how dramatically the number of employees in the agency business declined. The just surviving that time period was a major feat. And if you look at our history, the wilderness has always been a theme for our company. We survived the .com bust, boom and bust.
Yep.
We survived our own growth, major growth, significant growth, and then our own wandering. We survived the recession. And all of that growing into the national brand we've become, all of that was done in Albuquerque, New Mexico, which I will say is an amazing place to live, filled with culture and history. There's a lot of great things about Albuquerque, but it's not known as an advertising center, by far. And so all of that has been done in a place that isn't traditionally thought of for advertising. So the wilderness isn't some sort of something that we just preach and we think is kind of cool and we use it for new biz. The wilderness is in our blood. It's who we are.
Yeah, and that is so critical too, because you've got to live into and prosper from your most authentic stories. You can't make this stuff up. It's got to be a part of your DNA if you're really going to be successful, especially in differentiating yourself in a very, very crowded, loud, noisy market.
Yeah, and that's something that, recruitment has always been something that businesses here work very hard on. And it's difficult because, it's one thing to go to New York or wherever. It's another thing to go to Albuquerque. And so one of the things that we've really focused on is explaining how this isn't, our weakness being a little bit remote is actually our strength, in that the perspective you're able to gain here, and it comes from the geology, from our mountains, from our flora and fauna, and from the culture and the history, the perspective you're able to gain here. The reason the artists have been drawn here for decades is unmatchable anywhere. And so there really is a story to tell. There is a strength in our quote unquote weakness that allows us to help recruit, because there's, you're sitting in a skyscraper in New York, you don't see the sun or the moon for weeks. You lose yourself. When you come here, there's a healing and a motivation and inspiration that just isn't possible anywhere else. So the question would be, as you mentioned, your most authentic self, what is your story? Where do you live? How is it true to you? How do you take, whatever you think is the bane of your existence and turn that into a real strength? And I think that's also part of focus and part of finding your way out of the wilderness.
Turn your bane into a blessing. I love it. Jonathan, let us take a break here for a couple of other stories. And when we come back, I want to share with you the 5 C's that the Air Force uses in survival when they are up in the heavens, and how I actually used that because my father-in-law was a fairly famous fighter pilot. And I remember him telling me about these 5 C's and how then I actually implemented them in a boardroom when I was trying to make sense of a madness of a new job that I had just taken. But your approach to your book, Brand versus Wild, reminded me of that story. So I want to share that with you right after this. Since today's show is about reviving stale brands and helping them survive in the wild, what about the one brand that is all about our survival? The brand of climate change, or the climate change narrative. For 20 years, climate scientists, do-gooder documentaries like Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth and the liberal left have tried to message on the importance of climate science, humans' impact on global warming, and the devastating outcomes we're heading for. You might argue that this is one of the most urgent stories of our time, and yet it hasn't compelled us to change very much. Until maybe now, when President Trump pulled America out of the Paris Climate Agreement, he actually, perhaps unwittingly, did the climate movement a huge favor. Trump is the contradiction, the conflict every great brand story needs to become timely, relevant, and urgent in the marketplace. No conflict, no story. Think about it. Before Trump, the most powerful leader in the world, callously pulled America out of the Paris Agreement, the climate story only had climate skeptics to overcome. Instead of taking them head on, the climate storytellers chose to ignore them, essentially removing the essential element of a villain out of the story. They were taking away the contradiction and the conflict. We had nothing to rally around. That's why the climate narrative has been rather stale. Well, Dr. Randy Olson, author of Houston, We Have a Narrative, Why Science Needs Storytelling, and one of my guests on The Business of Story who revealed Trump's powerful narrative intuition that won him the White House, explains in a recent blog he wrote, he talks about Trump being the but in the and, but, and therefore structure that the client narrative has needed all along. In fact, his blog post is titled, Trump, Climate Hero of All Time? I love it. Trump, the blowhard embodiment of the science-dismissing climate deniers, is the dark force the movement needed. So here's how I now see the ABT, the and, but, and therefore, that has come together to make the climate story more compelling now than ever. So here we go. 97% or more of actively published climate scientists agree that global warming is due to human activities. And leaders from all countries except Nicaragua and Syria have agreed to the Paris Accord to cut carbon emissions to protect our planet. But President Donald Trump, the leader of the free world and the country that is the world's largest producer of greenhouse gases, has pulled America out of the Paris Agreement. Therefore, private and public sector leaders like California's Governor Brown, Walmart, Bank of America, Philip Morris, and Shell Oil are rallying to represent America and do our part for the collective good of the world. Do you see how it's come together? All of a sudden, we have a whole new look, a whole new feel, a way more compelling story because we have a focused anti-hero. We have contradiction and we have conflict that moves this forward. For another take on this, watch John Oliver on his HBO show Last Week Tonight with John Oliver. A few weeks ago, he did a brilliant segment on how Trump may be just the shot in the arm the overall movement needs. It's worth a watch, and I've got the link in our show notes. So, what's the moral of the story? Well, if your brand is stalled, stuck, or stale, raise the stakes. Find the disruption, the contradiction or conflict in the market that you can rally to and help your audiences overcome through a focused, purpose-driven brand story. And for that, in a weird sort of way, I guess, Trump is my story marketer of the week. People come to me and say, Park, we've got a great business model. We're making money and we're growing fast, but we don't have our brand story straight. And then I ask them what their biggest pain points are, and they tell me, well, our growth is requiring us to add a lot of new people, and now we don't have everyone pulling in the same direction. Plus, other companies have taken notice of our success, and we don't have a brand story that differentiates us from them. They also tell me that when their bankers or potential investors show up and ask them about their brand story, they don't have a clear narrative to share with them. In fact, that's often the most embarrassing part of not having their brand story straight. So if this sounds like you can start getting your story straight right now by downloading your own Business of Story how-to guide. I take you through the 10 proven steps of the story cycle system, complete with short explainer videos, so I'm there with you every step of the way. This guide will help you define the fundamentals of your authentic story. It'll help you clarify your number one position in your market to differentiate you from your competition, declare your unique value proposition, map your customer journey, and define your brand purpose, among other things. The story cycle system has helped companies like yours grow by as much as 400%. So put the Business of Story workbook to work for you and create epic growth for your enterprise and your people by crafting a story they can all live into and prosper from. Story on. Welcome back to Business of Story, and our guest today, Jonathan Davis Lewis, who is the partner and strategy director at McKee Wallwork Company in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And Jonathan has a new book out, Brand versus Wild, Building Resilient Brands for Harsh Business Environments. And Jonathan, have so enjoyed this conversation because I guess, I'm a Westerner at heart. I love really everything west of the Mississippi. East Coast is nice. It's fun to jump in and visit and do business out there. But sounds like I'm like you. I love the wilds of the West. And so the positioning that your agency has created of working with brands that are, stalled, stuck, or stale.
Right.
And helping them through the wilds as you do in, working with your own brand in the wilds of New Mexico. So I think it's really interesting. And as I had mentioned, when you were going through those 3 steps of when people find themselves lost, you got to take a deep breath and stop. Don't just run willy-nilly into the wilds. Otherwise, you'll get even more lost. Orient yourself, figure out where you're going next, and then focus on that mission to get there and learn from, I imagine, your experience of getting lost in the first place. Now, when I married my wife 30 years ago, her dad, Captain James Reynolds Major at the time, I guess, before he passed away, was a fairly famous World War II fighter pilot, and he flew in Korea. He was in Nam. He worked with the French Air Force. I mean, he was quite a guy, and I got a chance to sit and chat with him. Knew him for a year or so before he actually passed away after we got married. But he had told me something, and your 3 steps reminded me of this. He said, when a pilot gets in trouble, there are 5 C's that they're taught to do. So if they're lost, if they're up in their plane and they're totally lost in the skies, the 5 C's begin with climb. Actually, so pull up, get up above so you can kind of see around and orient yourself, and for heaven forbid, not fly into a mountain because you're lost. Then throttle back. So conserve is the next one. Again, take a deep breath, throttle back, pull yourself together, communicate, get somebody on the horn so that you can get another, voice in your head to help you know what's going on. I love this next one, confess. So get your ego out of the way, confess that you have a problem and you need some help getting down, and then you hope that person on the other end of that mic can locate you and get you down. And so the final C is comply. So you've got climb, conserve, communicate, confess, and comply. And I was before I started my agency over 20 years ago now, I was working as creative director for this very large, fast-growing company called Quorum International. They sold electronic devices around the world and headquartered here in Phoenix, and it was like growing gangbusters. I was brought in to help put together a product launch in just 5 weeks with 5 brand new products. We had no package designed for them, no marketing designed for them. And I was first introduced into this room of like 6 product managers, some other creatives, communication folks, and everybody still fairly new in their roles, looking at each other. And Jonathan, I think there had to have been 14 to 16 people in this room. And it was all really there for me because they wanted me to get a download of where we were, so we could figure out how in the next few weeks we were going to pull all of this together at a big launch at a sales symposium where they were bringing in 20,000 of their sales folks to introduce them, get them excited about the product, and go. And I have no idea why this happened. But as I was sitting there, I wasn't even saying a word. I was just taking notes. People were introducing themselves. They were giving me a sense of who they were, what their responsibilities were in the organization, and how I could help them. So I was just listening and madly taking these notes, and it popped in my mind. I had to do what Captain Jim Reynolds taught me. First climb, I had to kind of raise my consciousness above the mayhem of the room. And then I needed to conserve. So what that meant for me is I was like starting to hyperventilate, like what in the hell have I gotten myself into? I just took a deep breath, just started taking notes. And the way I conserved is I said nothing. I mean, I said absolutely nothing. I just listened and took notes, which was really hard for me. Then communicate. And what I did with that is I waited for everybody around the room to communicate who they were, what they were responsible for. And I was able to start seeing this mesh of agendas and how and where I could step in and help them in their varying agendas. And it also enabled me very quickly to understand the political nature of this group, who had, voice and who didn't, who was going to be potentially a troublemaker and who was going to be an ally. So I just let them communicate and take it all in. Then when I finally opened my mouth, I had to confess to them. And I confessed to them that, look, I'm brand new. We got a lot that we have to accomplish here. I will do my best to get caught up to speed with each and every one of them and where we were in the process. And if I didn't get to any one of them within the next week to 10 days, don't take it personally, that I just had to do it my way to figure out how we were going to pull all this stuff together. And then finally, comply is I asked them, is that okay with you? Is it okay if we approach it this way? And the most interesting thing in all of that, Jonathan, was that because I sat there and I went through these 5 C's of survival in this thing, that for some reason my voice carried more gravitas, more weight with them. For not having had any communication with them, let them download everything to me so I could figure out how I was going to survive this. And then once I got to that point of confessing, getting them on board with me, it's like I had the room. And it was such an eye-opening experience for me because it was purely out of my own personal survival. I didn't know how I was going to get through this thing, and it worked beautifully. So long-winded story, but I think it was fascinating because it did kind of follow your win-loss, stop, orient yourself, and then focus with your brand. Can you give us an example of a brand or two that you guys have worked with, that you help pull them out of the wilds and get them focused and the success they're having now?
Yeah, well, first of all, really, really cool story. And, those 5 C's are absolutely in line with what we're seeing in survival psychology. And in fact, for the research for the book, Brand vs. Wild, I pulled quite a bit from the survival manual from the Air Force specifically. Oh, really? And you'll see some quotes throughout the book simply because it was fascinating and it was really well done. And another thing in terms of, you mentioned in your grandfather.
The father-in-law.
I'm sorry, your
That's
father-in-law.
Okay, no problem.
Who was a well-known Air Force pilot. One of the chapters, 2 of the chapters discusses pretty in depth a gentleman by the name of John Boyd. Have you heard of John Boyd?
I have not, no.
John Boyd, he should be more well-known than he is. He's considered by many to be one of the greatest military minds in history, yet he was a bit of an outsider at the Pentagon, and he actually made his name in the Korean War, where he was known as 42nd Boyd, and he would challenge all the new recruits that if any of them, he would get up in the air with them, and he would place his plane in front of theirs. And he would say, I can get behind you in a kill shot position within 40 seconds. And if I can't do it in 40 seconds, I'll give you $40. And he never had to pay through the entire war. And he was just this incredible pilot. But at that time, during the Korean War, there's this fascinating thing happening where even though technically the Americans had inferior tech and inferior aircraft against the MiGs, they kept winning these battles. above Korea. And he was fascinated by it. He didn't understand why. And he developed this theory called the OODA loop. And in the OODA loop, which is observe, orient, decide, and act, he determined that while technically his aircraft was inferior, the American aircraft had better viewability and maneuverability. They weren't quite as fast. They didn't have quite as much firepower, but they could orient themselves better. They could see out of the aircraft literally better than their enemies. And then they could react faster because they had better maneuverability. And because of those two advantages, they kept beating their enemies. And so from that, the OODA loop he developed, he really put together this whole theory on how speed and orientation, being able to get through your OODA loop faster than your enemy, was actually the key to success in business and branding and in a lot of other places. And he applied it, of course, through military and his career in the Pentagon. So that's something that's drawn on quite a bit in the book, simply because after you've stopped, oriented, and focused, you need to be able to adapt in this new economy. And it requires us to think differently about business, think in different speeds, and really fundamentally change how we understand what makes us successful. It's not the biggest, strongest, most powerful aircraft. Those aren't the most powerful or the most successful aircraft in the air. It's actually the ones that can maneuver faster, that can see better. And that's, I think, a really important lesson for us as business people. When you look at companies that we've worked with, probably one that most recently has really exemplified everything that the book is about and actually is discussed quite heavily in Chapter 11 is French Funerals and Cremations. And they are a leading funeral home who provides a variety of services in death care. Now, I'll tell you what, if you're trying to market a company, death is one of the hardest things to market. Mm-hmm. Nobody wants to think about death. And in fact, actively try not to think about you. Mm-hmm. But it was their challenge was far bigger than this. Over the last 10 or 20 years, trends in death and death care have been dramatically changing. Cremations are on the rise, traditional burials are decreasing, and that's where a lot of the income came from in death care. And preferences are changing, so there's a lot less religious ceremonies, a lot more secular ceremonies. So everything is changing, and all the changes mean less revenue. And so, and mix that with an industry like death care that's very conservative, that doesn't make any changes unless it's incremental. You have kind of a dangerous situation where the whole industry, not just our client, the whole industry was stalled, stuck, and stale. So we actually partnered with 13 funeral homes around the country and conducted a national study to look at what is going on in death care. What do Americans think about death? And it was one of the most fun studies that we've ever conducted, just simply because we got to learn, everything about what Americans think. And we asked some really interesting questions around, you'd think beer and wine preference wouldn't have anything to do with your death care preferences, but they do. Things like that. So from that research, we identified that really, as opposed to other industries, death care was stuck in the past. And so not only did we start to brand French funerals and make them relevant once again to a younger market who had different preferences, but we actually started a startup called Passare, raised several $1 million, and moved all of the offline operations in death care online. And the point of this is that many times in today's marketplace, it's not just a brand problem or marketing problem. There's usually fundamental issues that these businesses are faced with that require far deeper and more fundamental solutions that might even have to do with the very foundation of your business, the assumptions you make in your business model. So in French Funerals' case, we created the startup, we moved offline operations online, we made things a lot easier for their customers. But then we went into the branding, and probably one of the most famous, pieces of messaging we created was the simplest billboard you'll ever see, and it simply said Yodo. And half the market had no idea what in the world is this death care billboard that says Yodo mean. And then the younger half of the market, they got it, and it was simply a play off of the term we've all heard, YOLO. So you only live once. For in death care, You only die once. And this one simple board, well, it was surrounded by, of course, integrated campaign. This one simple board was really the breakthrough. And we got so much coverage. We had radio DJs talking about it. We had people calling in. What are they talking about? What does this mean? And that began a journey of relevance for this company that after several years of stagnation in terms of revenue, they turned the ship around. They found growth again in a declining industry, in fact. So we fundamentally addressed their marketing issues while fundamentally addressing their business model issues through this startup.
Well, I love it. So you created the simplest of stories to bring them relevance. And I imagine the older crowd, because I was not familiar with YOLO. Now that you say it, it kind of rings a bell. So the older crowd would probably have to ask then their kids potentially, or as you say, they were calling in saying, what does YOLO mean? And then it invites them into the story, and you have an aha moment within the brand story itself.
We had a lot of fun anecdotes where, grandpa would be driving with granddaughter and see the billboard and say, what in the world? And so it actually sparked this conversation around the very topic nobody wanted to talk about. And it was even, between the generations, which is in, American culture is terrified of even talking about death. And it started a conversation around really important things that we should be talking about. So we were able to not only drive business, but actually start a conversation around in something that's important for all of us to consider.
Wow, great stuff. Well, Jonathan, we are coming to the close of this show. What if we are lost in the wild? You've covered a lot of main points. But if I'm listening to this and I'm like, man, I am totally lost in the wild, what are the 1, 2, or 3 things that I should do immediately to get myself headed in the right direction?
Well, I really think it comes down to, first and foremost, understand yourself. And when we're lost, we usually lie to ourselves or we hide from the truth. And if you can take a look at yourself, if you can understand the 10-80-10 theory, that probably you're going to be paralyzed by your fear. And if you can understand the very predictable response to disruption, in that you probably are inconsistent, you probably are unfocused. If you can just stop for a moment and consider who you are and how you're likely to react to this challenge, then you can take that next step that you mentioned. I loved what you said about confess and the fifth C. What was the fifth C?
Comply. Confess and comply.
Those are amazing. Confess and comply. And that's really, in the book it discusses admit, submit, and then commit. Because if you're able to confess and say, okay, something's wrong here, then you're overcoming your own arrogance. You're overcoming your own pride. Pride kills in the wild. So if you can overcome that, if you can confess and then comply. Now, this is something that's really fascinating. There's something called the will to live. It's mysterious. Survival psychologists don't quite understand it. There's enough circumstances and evidence that this will to live exists in survival scenarios, but nobody understands quite how it works. But essentially what it is two people can be thrust into the same exact scenario, survival, challenge. One, they're both healthy, they're both under the same stress. One will live, one will survive, and the other, by their own choice, will give up and often die. Not because their health gave out, not because they didn't have enough sustenance, because they chose to give up. And I think that's so important that once you get to that last C, or in my case, committing to live, you are capable of more than you even imagine. You're capable of getting through the most extreme scenarios on Earth, things that you can't imagine. I know this is true because I've looked at the research. People are capable of incredible things, but you have to have the will to live. You have to have the desire to survive and then thrive. If you don't have that, then you'll probably go the way of many, many companies.
I had on the show here about 3 weeks ago, Robert Swan, and he is a polar expeditionary gentleman, the only person in history to trek by foot to both the North and the South Poles unaided. And he's about ready to go back to the South Pole again with his 23-year-old son, Barney, in November. And I had him on the show, and he talked a lot about leadership and how do you lead people in a crazy, perilous mission like this. And he said, the last leg of that trip trip, the last 50 miles to the South Pole or so, he goes, your strength is gone, your muscles are gone, you've lost, I think he said 70 pounds. And he goes, you know what gets you there? It's not your body, it's your mind. It's being able to overcome all of that. So and I suppose it's that will to live mechanism that you're talking about right there, is that the biggest, the fastest, and the strongest aren't always the most formidable. It's the one with the strongest mind, I suppose, that can really appreciate where you are in a situation, recognize it, admit to the situation. I love your admit, submit, and commit. And then do the things you got to do to get through it, to live into an epic, epic story.
It's absolutely true. And, I have not only from his anecdote and experience, but from, every true survival story of the last 150 years, the same thing comes up every time, and that is absolutely true.
Well, Jonathan, so great to have you here. Where can people learn more about you, your book, your agency? Where shall we send them?
Well, certainly you can find Brand vs. Wild at anywhere books are sold. Check it out on Amazon. You can find out more about me and my company, McKee Wallwork, at jonathandavidlewis.com. And, all of the links to all of my social platforms and the book and everything's there.
All right. Well, thank you. What a fascinating show. This has been a lot of fun. I love your approach to helping brands versus the wild, building resilient brands for harsh business environments. The next time you're in our harsh business environment here in Phoenix, I hope you'll knock on my door and swing by.
Let's grab a beer.
Would love it. And thank you all for listening to this edition of Business of Story. Be here next week when we will have another story artist like Jonathan Davis Lewis here to help you craft and tell compelling brand stories that sell. And if you would do me a huge favor, please feel free to share this podcast with your world. Go to iTunes. Leave me a comment, give me a rating there. It just helps me spread the good word of Business of Story, and I'd appreciate that very much. And, of course, if I can help you, visit me over at businessofstory.com, where I've got tools and tips and techniques for you to build your brand story. And as Jonathan Davis Lewis said, to truly focus your story and focus your mission so that you can rise above the noise, rise above the cacophony of the wilderness out there of communication that we are all competing in. So thanks again for listening, and until next week, have a wonderful life.